All right, let's talk about Amos as we are continuing our reading the Bible in the year. A little background. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a background on Amos and we'll just go through the verses. It's a smaller book, so I don't feel like I need to break this video up. So, I'll give you a little background and then we'll kind of talk about some of the verses and what this means. So, first of all, when we look at prophetic language, it's hard. Like, I had to take multiple classes in seminary to help to interpret prophetic language. So it's not always easy to understand. So if you read the prophets and you struggle at times with what it means or what's going on, that's okay. It's not the easiest part of the Bible to study. So something to keep in mind with prophets. Prophets are an intermediary, right, between God and an audience. So God speaks through the prophets, and so a lot of times when you'll see where it says like God says, it's actually the prophet speaking. The prophet is actually speaking on behalf of God, though it may label it as such. Sometimes the audience is a king or a ruler. Sometimes it's a group of people. And in Amos's writing, it's Israel. He's talking to Israel, and so, but that's just kind of something to kind of keep in mind because sometimes we get kind of confused, like. Is that the prophet talking or is that God talking? So it's actually the prophet speaking. That's just something to keep in mind. Amos, a little bit about Amos. He is the oldest of the prophetic writings we have, written around 750 BCE, so 2,700 years ago, almost 2,000 years ago. So a long time ago. He lived in the hills. In the Judean hills right around Bethlehem. So he was considered a herdsman, not a professional prophet in some way. They actually had a certain school that people would attend to teach about some of this work. Elijah and Elisha each have been head of what's called a school of prophets. It's kind of like what we consider a modern day seminary. Amos did not come from that. So what kings would do is they would take some of these prophets from these schools and they would employ them, all right, and hire them up, and these prophets would speak to the kings. But a lot of times they told the kings what the kings wanted to hear. They didn't actually speak truly on behalf of God. And so here you have Amos, who doesn't come from that school, who isn't a professional prophet in some way, and is just a regular dude doing his life, but God comes to him and speaks to him and puts him in this role. So he is just kind of a normal person, and he speaks some harsh words to Israel and speaks some real harsh truth. He doesn't tell the people what they want to hear. There's something to kind of know about this too, is that the way God is kind of working in this is not an instance where God is speaking to Amos and Amos is relaying it to the people saying, hey, God's upset. He's calling you to change. You need to change. If you don't, there's going to be trouble. That's a typical kind of message. That's not what Amos is bringing. Amos is saying, God's upset with you. You're going to be punished. That's it. There's no getting out of it. There's none of that. You're going to be punished. That's it. Now, we struggle with that sometimes with God and the violence that God may do. And like, why would God punish his chosen people? I always kind of look at it like a parent, like a good parent, right? Sometimes as parents, like we tell our kids over and over not to do something and they do it. Eventually, there has to be some kind of punishment for their wrongdoings, right? As a parent, you choose what that would be. And this is God doing it. And God's choosing this punishment. And kind of speaking through Amos, and it's a tough message. It's a tough message, and so we do have to tussle with that with God at times about how we see Him and how He's going to go about punishing Israel. But Israel has chosen to not follow God and has chosen to do a lot of injustices. Amos is kind of considered a social justice gospel, and I know when people hear the word social justice, it kind of freaks people out. Like, I've had a lot of people tell me you can't talk about social justice in church. It's not biblical. I completely disagree. Amos is a social justice kind of gospel. He is talking about all the injustices that Israel is doing, and that is why they're being punished. And so a lot of the prophets speak about justice issues. So social justice is biblical. I don't know how anybody can make the argument it's not if they read the prophet. You would have to ignore the prophets and you'd have to ignore Jesus to come to the conclusion that the Bible and that some of the people in the Bible are not doing social justice work, right? Because anytime we want to fix these issues of injustice, we're doing social justice work. So, and this is what Amos is. He is aligned in kind of a socio-political kind of setting. That's what his message kind of speaks to. And so Amos is really hard to get away from. Like, he is a one that we really can look at as somebody that stands on justice issues. And what Amos shares a lot is his visions that he's had. So imagine having a dream and trying to explain your dreams to people. So sometimes imagery, it's not like always a direct statement. There may be imagery and things like that at times can be confusing for us. And a lot of times this may be how a prophet speaks and what they do. So we have to kind of figure out what's being said. And so interpreting can be difficult. And so be patient with yourself in that. But let's dive in here a little bit into Amos, and as we learn a little bit more about this. So in chapter 1, you have these things being said. There's 3 transgressions and then a 4th. The idea of this is that they have just committed a lot. Not so much specifically they did 3 and maybe a 4th, or like they've done a lot. That's kind of the idea of this, and how he writes and tells this. And in the first chapter, it's a little bit about what Israel's doing to other nations. They are committing injustice to other nations. They're doing this through using excessive violence and war to people. For God is the chosen people, or Israel is the chosen people, right, for God, and by God. It doesn't mean that God isn't with other nations. God is present with other nations. Other nations are part of God's creation too. We forget that at times. I think we forget that. I would even say here in America, we forget that. Like we think we are such a chosen nation. We forget that God is still God of other nations as well. With Israel, he's trying to use Israel as an example to other nations to how to live out a life with God. But the problem is they keep disobeying. I think we can learn a lot about this and how we operate our own country if we are going to claim we are a Christian nation, if we want to say we are one nation under God. I don't believe that we operate right now like that. I don't think that we align at all with as a nation a lot with what God would want from us. And part of it right now is how we treat at times other nations. We have to really look at that. We should be in covenant with other nations, and it should be a reciprocal relationship of allyship and help, right? We don't have everything in our country that we need. We have to get resources from other places, and we need to share resources with people. But when we go to war, when we use our power to really hurt and dominate people, which we have done historically since really kind of the creation of our nation, rather through slavery, through war, through violence, we have to just be aware of that as a nation. If we want to say we are one nation under God, well, part of that is how we interact with others. And are we committing injustices to other nations, or are we living justly? And if for Israel in this time, they are not living justly. And God is saying, you're going to be punished for this. No way out of it. So God is issuing his judgment on what he's going to do to them for their wrongdoings. Chapter 2, we get into where Judah doesn't seem to be following the law. That's established in Deuteronomy. So they're disobeying the law. So we have chapter 1, Israel's just, taking advantage of other nations. Then Judah's not following the law. And Israel, they've made a lot of injustices as well. There's some kind of selling of people to earn money. I wouldn't look at this as slavery as a sense, because slavery was so prominent during that time. Like, one of the things we have to kind of understand is that there is, in the Bible, they justify slavery. We have learned through a Christ-centered ethic, and even I think looking back at God, how God works in liberation of people through the Exodus, that God and Jesus both are liberators, that they want to free people from those. But they use slavery in that time as part of the culture, whether it could be indentured servants, people who maybe spent their whole life working off a debt for something, right? Like, that was what they had to do. But we have created an ethic now that says slavery is bad, and I hope we can agree on that. So I would say that the selling of people that they're doing is that they're taking advantage of people in multiple ways. How do we do that today, right? Think about how do we take advantage of people today? How are people taken advantage of to continue to increase wealth and power of other people, right? Wealthy and powerful people will continue to take advantage of poor and vulnerable people to increase wealth and status, to hold them down so they can stay high. This is what is going on, and God is not happy. We should be unhappy when we see that today. We should not allow that as Christians. We should speak out and vote and try to get our policymakers and the powerful people to have some compassion and care towards those that we are oppressing, and not to take advantage of people to enrich wealth. That goes against a Christ-centered ethic. There's no care for the poor being done by Israel. There's also an incestual relationship going on. They use pretty graphic verbiage in saying son and father go in to a woman together. That means they're having sex, and you have to tussle with some of the imagery of sex in the Bible. If that makes you uncomfortable, it's a real part, because what is happening is people use incestual relationships as a form of worship to other gods and other nations. That goes against God's covenant. That goes against God's law, what God wants, right? So we know that now to be just illegal, period. But in that day and age, Baal, who was worshipped by people, that was a part of maybe a worship practice for them. And so that's why you'll see a lot of banning of what would be called sexual immorality. It's because of the worship practices, how they use sex in these worship practices. So God's saying, nope, no good, can't do this. There's religious corruption. People are using their power in the church, synagogue, temple, not really church at that time, but they're using their religion to continue to oppress people and enrich themselves. And that's wrong. God is saying, here's what's going to happen to you. There's no out. You're not getting out of it. Here's what's going to occur. And he basically tells them, you can bring your army, Israel, you're still going to lose. And so that kind of all happens in chapter 2. So you get an idea of what Israel is committing and doing, and kind of the warnings by God. You get into chapter 3, Amos starts with some rhetorical questions, and then he tells the Philistines and the Egyptians to come to Mount Samaria, come up to the top, and then you can witness the corruption of Israel's people. Maybe this is a warning to them, like, hey, this is God's chosen people. He's going to do that. Like, they're corrupt, and he's going to punish them. Be warned as well. Be warned of who the God of Israel is, and turn from your ways. So it could be, I'm going to bring you along to have you look at this as a warning to you too. But they are brought to view the corruption being done in Israel. And in verse 14, it says he is going to tear down the religious places in Bethel and the summer homes of the rich, basically the summer and winter homes of the rich, right? So God is coming he's going to tear down these corrupt temples. He's going to tear down these homes that people have purchased through unjust means. It's all going to be destroyed. So there's a warning to them, right? So we got a warning, we got multiple, there's all sorts of people right now getting warnings and are saying the destruction is coming. Chapter 4, it starts with punishment to wealthy women, which is interesting, right? He specifically calls them out. Now, what's interesting about this, if we look back to the slavery days here in America, a lot of times the women were considered to be the worst part of the household, because they're the ones at home with the slaves, and they would really abuse the slaves. They would really be at the head of some of the worst parts of that. And I think that probably was even back in this time where, women didn't work, when women stayed home. And so they were probably taking advantage of the people around them. I'm not going to pick on women necessarily in this, but obviously historically, we can see in our own country and now and all the way back in Israel where this was being done. And so, and the men are just as guilty. So I'm not giving the men a pass by any means, but God just specifically calls out the women for their behavior in this. And it's a warning. It's a warning to them. Warning to them that God's coming and he's gonna punish them. Chapter 5, we get to the gate. They talk about the gate in chapter 5. That means the courts. So you're talking about injustice in the courts that are occurring. So when they use that term gate, that's what they're talking about. And the wealthy are committing injustice in the courts. They're committing injustice to uphold their status. And I think a modern way, and I don't know how we would solve this today, but something that we do today, or something that's prevalent, right? If you can afford a good enough attorney, and it versus somebody who can't, you have a much better chance of winning in court. That would be a form of an injustice, right? It's not always about the actual case itself. It's about, can you afford the right representation to get you out of it? And I think you can see this in celebrities and wealthy people. They don't get punished in the same way. You could look at the drug war in the 80s. Cocaine and crack, the same drug in a different form, two different penalties associated. We can see in our courts where we commit injustice. That's a truth. That's a fact. It's there. It doesn't mean that there aren't good judges, and yeah, there are, sure, but there is injustice that has occurred in the courts for a long time, and it's occurred back in this time, and we should be fighting to create a more just justice system where all people get equal treatment under the law. Like that is a biblical ethic, I would say. And so God's saying, I'm going to take the stuff that you've acquired through these unjust ways. I'm gonna take it away. And God is also going to reject their worship and offerings because of the injustice they're committing. He isn't so much concerned with their worship style or what's going on. He's against some of the practices, obviously, but he is more. The reason why he's rejecting is because you're not going to worship me and do this stuff and then go out and act a fool. You're not going to go out and do these wrongdoings that I'm totally against. I'm going to reject your worship. You don't get to praise me. You don't get to butter me up, right? If again, a parent and a child relationship, right? If I go to punish my kid, then my kid wants to come and hang out close to me and oh, Dad, I love you so much, and you're the sweet, and Dad, you're the best. Like, try to butter me up to soften up my punishment. Like God's saying, you're not going to be able to do that through your worship. Like, it's still coming. And so, again, it's just, no matter how Israel wants to try to explain or justify or get away from it, God's saying, I'm going to punish you. You have to learn. And so he's going to reject their worship. When we get to chapter 6, the many of the wealthy are continuing to live very well while committing injustice. This is spoken about here. In verses 14, we get a naming of an unknown nation that will oppose Israel. God is raising up a nation to oppose Israel, which is really interesting. Again, God is present with other nations. God wants to use Israel as an example to nations for how to live a life under God. And I would say, fast forward this, obviously this has not worked. Israel continues to turn away from God throughout history. God brings Jesus to us as a living, breathing example of what he's talking about. And so that's kind of the way I've always kind of looked at this relationship between God and Israel and God and Jesus, and the example that both are supposed to be setting for us. And Jesus sets the right example. But Israel just seems to struggle for a long time with following God, and is constantly pulled to these other gods, these other nations, other ways of life, and God is unhappy with this. Especially since God explains that, hey, man, I have saved you in some ways, right? I have freed you in some ways, and then and why would you turn away when I've shown you what I'm capable of doing, when I have loved you and cared for you, right? And you'll learn a little bit more about this in Hosea, about God's deep hurt and love he has for Israel, but the deep hurt that he's experiencing because of their turning away. So we'll go to chapter 7. Amos is told he is no longer allowed to prophesy in Israel. He's not told he can't be a prophet. He can't prophesy, but he just can't do it in Israel anymore. So they remove him from that. And so this is a lot of what you kind of got going on in Amos. It's a pretty quick read, but it is just, it's a tough read because there is not a ask of a turning away or the Israel not being told to do something different to avoid God's punishment. Amos is just laying out all the wrongdoings and speaking about how God is going to punish them. So that's the breakdown on Amos. It is an important message for us today. We can take inventory of what Amos is talking about and look at our own institution of church. We can look at our communities. We can look at our country. What are we doing to commit injustice to others? And where are areas that we can speak up on the behalf of other people to create a more just society, right? I mean, it is about equity and equality in the kingdom. And that's what God is wanting from Israel. And not to be turned away, but to remember that God's with them, and that God loves them, and that God's going to give them a good life. But quit disobeying, and now they're going to be punished for that disobedience. So that's Amos. So keep on reading the Bible, keep on reading through the prophets. Let it challenge you. Amos will challenge you. But I hope you enjoy reading the Bible and enjoy this book of Amos.